Good morning. Today we look at Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 20. And chapter 13 begins with Jesus and the disciples. They were sitting across watching, and yesterday the widow had put her coin in, and as Jesus comes out, one of the disciples looks back at the temple. And the temple wasn't just one building, but it was, the temple plus the housing for the priests, and it was quite a complex. And the temple itself was very large and impressive. And one of the disciples comments on that. Look what large stones and what large buildings. And just the other day I saw something I hadn't seen before about, I don't remember where it was, but there are these huge rocks that are, carved in the ground, and they're round, perfectly, shaped. And how could that be? It's just like the pyramids. How did people have the ability to cut those stones? And so for the disciples to look at that building and be impressed, because the stonemasons, the way they cut and moved the stones, and it reminds me too of the Israelites when they were captive in Egypt. They were making bricks and making things that way to build, and the ability for humans to manufacture, to build things, that were like that. And this temple looked indestructible, looked like it would stand forever. And Jesus says to them, not one stone will be left. And we know from history that in about the year 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. Indeed it was. And what Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another. They will all be thrown down. They were knocked down and dragged away, and it was gone. And so this seemingly indestructible building was indeed destructible. And I think about, we look at so many buildings today, and I mean they're tearing them down. We watch videos of huge hotels, huge facilities that they put these dynamite, and boom, and it just collapse down to nothing. And it looks like a perfectly good building that, and totally destroyed. And it's just, I mean, the waste of it, doesn't make sense. But, some of these things that seem like they will last forever, we understand, that they don't. One thing that does last forever is God's love and God's grace, and that's why we have the Bible, and why we read it. And so Jesus then was sitting opposite of this temple that they were admiring, and Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So here we have four disciples. Peter and Andrew are brothers. James and John are brothers. They asked him, well, when is this going to be? When will the temple be destroyed, and what signs should we be watching for? And it's, is this going to be the end of times? Kind of the question in there too that way. And, but, it's just, beware of many will lead you astray. Many will come in my name. And we look throughout history, and how many have come. I mean, I can think of several since I was born in the 50s, 1950s. I can think of many who came, with this is it, we are the one, I am the one. And I heard, not so long ago about another that, he is the end all to be all. And, and so it's just, Jesus has this warning, to beware. Many will come in my name and say, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And then when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, but the end is still to come. We have no idea. Nation will rise against nation. We've had wars and battles continually. I mean, you think about Israel, the Mideast. I mean, such a war-torn area, and so many other things going on in the world, between North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam, and Ukraine and Russia, and just, the battles. And, it's just everybody wonders, is this the time? And, it's been that way for all my life, I know, and it's been that way, ever since Jesus' time, that we wonder, is now the time? Well, I mean, it could just as well be now as any time, but again, it may be not any this time as well as any. But he says, this is the beginning of the birth pangs. And then he says, for yourselves beware. And here he's talking basically, I think, to the disciples, because they are going to have their lives torn upside down. They're going to be arrested. They're going to be beaten in synagogues. You'll stand before governors and kings. And, he says the good news must be proclaimed to all nations. And we know that, after Jesus' resurrection, he called Paul to be the disciple, and Paul was the one that did many missionary journeys. He wrote many of the letters that are in our New Testament, the books we call them. And so the good news must be proclaimed to all nations. And there are many people in the world yet today that have not yet heard of Jesus Christ, and many as well that have heard of him and choose to ignore and to say it's nothing to it. But Jesus says, it's going to be a lot of struggles. There's going to be a lot of grief. There's going to be a lot of unrest, and families will be divided, and families aren't maybe quite so bad today, but yet, if a Jew becomes a Christian, they run the risk of being kicked out of their family. If a Muslim becomes a Christian, they run that risk, that they are dead to their family. And so, there is that yet today of that conflict, of that distrust that comes between all of those. Then verse 13 ends with the one who endures to the end will be saved. And it's just, to have that faith in Jesus, to trust it beyond all things. And for some people, that's really hard, a real challenge, because it can separate them from their families. It can separate them from their friends. Sometimes people who are Christian, who practice their faith, find themselves, shunned by some of the others that they've maybe known all their lives. But, thankfully it doesn't happen too often. Verse 14 continues this talk about the end. He says, when you see the desolating sacrilege, and there's different words for that, sometimes different, but the desolating sacrilege is, when they start bringing the idols and the Gentiles start taking over the synagogues, and they are no longer, houses of worship, but become, houses of, mockery, and it's just, all through the Old Testament as well, we would see the Israelites, worshiping Baal, worshiping false gods, and, having their worship poles set up different places, and Jesus says, beware of that, the desolating sacrilege, and, sacrilege is something that shouldn't happen. It's bringing dishonor. And, in parentheses in this Bible and other places where I've read too, it says, let the reader understand. And, it is, it doesn't help, just the desolating sacrilege, boom, let the reader understand, but it is, when the non-believers come in and ruin the temple, and make mockery of our temples, of our churches, of our worship areas. He says, flee to the mountains. And part of it too is like when, for these Jewish people that Jesus is talking with, they are under Roman oppression right now. And if the city of Jerusalem is being under siege, and under that, how do you flee? How do you get out of there? I mean, it's, so this is a struggle for these people. That, we can just read this quickly and don't think anything of it. But for the early believers, life was hard, and they did risk their being arrested and being convicted of crimes just because they believed in Jesus Christ, and he says, and pray that it may not be in winter, You know, if this desolating sacrilege comes, and the destruction of the temple and the overrunning of everything, and you need to flee, you know, it's a lot better to have to flee in the summertime when the weather is nice than in the winter when how do you survive and how do you, you know, for food and shelter that way. And verse 20 doesn't bring us, you know, it brings some hope. He says, if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. You know, so these end times, whenever they come, you know, Jesus says the Lord has cut short those days, and it's just, I mean, you look at this stuff of, you know, when it's all going to happen, and I'm so thankful I don't worry about it. I mean, it's just, you know, if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, that's just great. But, you know, you know, just live your life believing and trusting in God today. And that's being faithful to the end. Just trusting and believing in God and not worrying, you know, if today is the day that the world ends. Not a big deal.